Chapter 6. Pearl. We have as yet hardly spoken of the infant, that little creature whose innocent life had sprung, by the inscrutable decree of Providence, a lovely and immortal flower out of the rank luxuriance of a guilty passion. How strange it seemed to the sad woman as she watched the growth and the beauty that became every day more brilliant, and the intelligence that threw its quivering sunshine over the tiny features of this child, her Pearl. For so had Esther called her, not as a name expressive of her aspect, which had nothing of the calm, white, unimpassioned lustre that would be indicated by the comparison, but she named the infant Pearl as being a great price, purchased with all she had, her mother's only treasure. How strange indeed! Man had marked this woman's sin by a scarlet letter, which had such potent and disastrous efficacy that no human sympathy could reach her, save it were sinful like herself. God, as a direct consequence of the sin which man thus punished, had given her a lovely child, whose place was on the same dishonored bosom to connect her parent for ever with the race and descent of mortals, and to be finally a blessed soul in heaven. Yet these thoughts affected Esther Prynne less with hope than apprehension. She knew that her deed had been evil. She could have no faith, therefore, that its result would be good. Day after day she looked fearfully into the child's expanding nature, after dreading to detect some dark and wild peculiarity that should correspond with the guiltiness in which she owed her being. Certainly there was no physical defect. By its perfect shape, its vigor, and its natural dexterity in use of all its untried limbs, the infant was worthy to have been brought forth in Eden, worthy to have been left there, to be plaything for the angels after the world's first parents were driven out. The child had a native grace which does not invariably coexist with faultless beauty. Its attire, however simple, always impressed the beholder as if it were the very garb that precisely became it best. But little Pearl was not clad in rustic weeds. Her mother, with a morbid purpose that may be better understood hereafter, and bought the richest tissues that could be procured, and allowed her imaginative faculty its full play in the arrangement and decoration of the dresses which the child wore before the public eye. So magnificent was the small figure when thus arrayed, and such was the splendor of Pearl's own proper beauty shining through the gorgeous robes which might be extinguished a paler loveliness, that there was an absolute circle of radiance around her and the darksome cottage floor, and yet a russet gown, torn and soiled with the child's rude play, made a picture of her just as perfect. Pearl's aspect was imbued with the spell of infinite variety. In this one child there were many children, comprehending full scope between the wildflower prettiness of a peasant baby and the pomp in the little of an infant princess. Throughout all, however, there was this trait of passion, a certain depth of hue, which she never lost, and if in any of her changes she had grown fainter or paler, she would have ceased to be herself. It would have no longer been Pearl. This outward mutability indicated and did not more than fairly express the various properties of her inner life. Her nature appeared to possess depth too, as well as variety, but, or else Esther's fears deceived her, it lacked reference and adaptation to the world into which she was born. The child could not be made amenable to rules. In giving her existence, a great law had been broken, and the result was a being whose elements were perhaps beautiful and brilliant, but all in disorder, or with an order peculiar to themselves, amidst which the point of variety and arrangement was difficult or impossible to be discovered. Esther could only account for the child's character, and even then most vaguely and imperfectly, by recalling what she herself had been during that momentous period, while Pearl was imbibing her soul from the spiritual world, and her bodily frame from its material of earth. The mother's impassioned state had been the medium through which were transmitted to the unborn infant the rays of its moral life, and however white and clear originally, they had taken the deep stains of crimson and gold, the fiery luster and the black shadow, and the untempered light of the intervening substance. Above all, the warfare and the untempered light of the intervening substance, above all, the warfare of Esther's spirit at the epoch of perpetuated in Pearl. She could recognize her wild, desperate, defiant mood the flightiness of her temper, and even some of the very cloud-shaped of gloom and despondency that had brooded in her heart. They were now illuminated by the morning radiance of a young child's disposition, but later in the day of earthly existence might be prolific of the storm and the whirlwind. The discipline of the family in those days was by a far more rigid kind than now. The frown of the harsh rebuke, the frequent application of the rod, enjoined by the Scripture authority, were used not merely in the way of punishment for the actual offenses, but as a wholesome regime for the growth and promotion of all child's virtues. Esther Prynne, nevertheless, the lonely mother of this one child, ran little risk of erring on the side of undue severity. Mindful, however, of her own errors and misfortunes, she early sought to impose a tender but strict control over the infant immortality that was committed to her charge. But the task was beyond her skill. After testing both smiles and frowns, and proving that neither mode of treatment possessed any calculable influence, Esther was ultimately compelled to stand aside and permit the child to be swayed by her own impulses. Physical compulsion or restraint was effectual, of course, while it lasted, as to any other kind of discipline, whether addressed to her or to her mind or heart. Little Pearl might or might not be within its reach in accordance with the caprice that ruled the moment. Her mother, while Pearl was yet an infant, grew acquainted with a certain peculiar look that warned her when it would be labor thrown away to insist, persuade, or plead. It was a look so intelligent yet inexplicable, so perverse, sometimes so malicious, but generally accompanied by a wild flow of spirits, that Esther could not help questioning at such moments whether Pearl was a human child. She seemed rather an airy sprite, which, after playing its fantastic sports for a little while upon the cottage floor, would flit away with a mocking smile. Whenever that look appeared in her wild, bright, deeply black eyes, it invested her with a strange remoteness and intangibility. It was as if she were hovering in the air and might vanish like a glimmering light that comes we know not whence, and goes we not know whither. Beholding it, Esther was constrained to rush towards the child, to persuade the little elf in the flight which she invariably began, to snatch her to her bosom with a close pressure and earnest kisses, not so much from overflowing love as to assure herself that Pearl was flesh and blood, and not utterly delusive. But Pearl's laugh, when she was caught, though full of merriment and music, made her mother more doubtful than ever. Heart-smitten at this bewildering and baffling spell that so often came between herself and her sole treasure, whom she had bought so dear and who was all her world, Esther sometimes burst into passionate tears. Then, perhaps, for there was no foreseeing how it might affect her, Pearl would frown, and clench her little fist, and harden her small features into a stern, unsympathizing look of discontent. Not seldom she would laugh anew, and louder than before, like a thing incapable and unintelligent of human sorrow. Or, but this more rarely happened, she would be convulsed with a rage of grief, and sob out her love for her mother in broken words, and seem intent on proving that she had a heart by breaking it. Yet Esther was hardly safe in confiding herself to that gusty tenderness. It passed as suddenly as it came. Brooding over all these matters, the mother felt like one who has evoked a spirit, but by some irregularity in the process of conjuration has failed to win the master word that should control this new and incomprehensible intelligence. Her only real comfort was when the child lay in the placidity of sleep. Then she was sure of her, and tasted hours of quiet, sad, delicious happiness, until perhaps, with that perverse expression glimmering from beneath her opening lids, little Pearl awoke. How soon, with that strange rapidity indeed, did Pearl arrive at an age that was capable of social intercourse, beyond the mother's ever-ready smile and nonsense words. And then what a happiness would it have been could Esther Prynne have heard her clear bird-like voice mingling with the uproar of other childish voices, and have distinguished and unravelled her own darling's tones amid all the entangled outcry of a group of supportive children. But this could never be. Pearl was born an outcast of the infantile world, an imp of evil, emblem of and product of sin. She had no right among the christened infants. Nothing was more remarkable than the instinct, as it seemed, with which the child comprehended her loneliness, the destiny that had drawn an inviolable circle round her. round about her, the whole peculiarity, in short, of her position in respect to the other children. Never, since her release from prison, had Esther met the public gaze without her. In all her walks about town, Pearl, too, was there, first as the babe in arms, and afterwards as the little girl, small companion of her mother, holding a forefinger with her whole grasp, and tripping along the rate of 3 or 4 footsteps to one of Esther's. She saw the children of the settlement on the grassy margin of the street, or at the domestic thresholds, disporting themselves in such grim fashion as the puritanic nurture would permit, playing at going to church perchance, or at scourging Quakers, or taking scalps in a shame fight with the Indians, or scaring one another with freaks of imitative witchcraft. Pearl saw and gazed intently, but never sought to make acquaintance. If spoken to, she would not speak again. If the children gathered about her, as they sometimes did, Pearl would grow positively terrible in her puny wrath, snatching up stones to fling at them. What shrill, incoherent exclamations that made her mother tremble, because they had so much the sound of a witch's anathemas in some unknown tongue. The truth was that little Puritans, being the most intolerant brood that ever lived, had got a vague idea of something outlandish, unearthly, or at variance with ordinary fashions in the mother and child, and therefore scorned them in their hearts, and not unfrequently reviled them with their tongues. Pearl felt this sentiment and requited it with the bitterest hatred that could be supposed to rankle in a childish bosom. These outbreaks of fierce temper had a kind of value and even comfort for her mother, because there was at least an intelligible earnestness in the mood, instead of the fitful caprice that so often thwarted her in the child's manifestations. It appalled her, nevertheless, to discern here again a shadowy reflection of the evil that had existed in herself. All this enmity and passion had Pearl inherited an inalienable right out of Esther's heart. Mother and daughter stood together in the same circle of seclusion from human society, and in nature of the child seemed to be perpetuated by unquiet elements that had distracted Esther Prynne before Pearl's birth, but had since begun to be soothed away by the softening influences of maternity. At home, within, and around her mother's cottage, Pearl wanted not a wide and various circle of acquaintance. The spell of life went forth from her ever-creative spirit and communicated itself to 1,000 objects as a torch kindles a flame wherever it may be applied. The unlikeliest materials, a stick, a bunch of rags of flour, the puppets of Pearl's witchcraft, and without undergoing any outward change, became spiritually adapted to whatever drama occupied the stage of her inner world. Her one baby voice served a multitude of imaginary personages, old and young, to talk withal. The pine trees, aged, black, and solemn, and flinging groans and other melancholy utterances on the breeze, needed little transformation to figure as Puritan elders. The ugliest weeds of the garden were their children, whom Pearl smote down and uprooted most unmercifully. It was wonderful the vast variety of forms into which she threw her intellect, with no continuity, indeed, but darting up and dancing always in a state of preternatural activity, soon sinking down as if exhausted by so rapid and feverish a tide of life, and succeeded by other shapes of a similar wild energy. It was like nothing so much as the phantasmagoric play of the northern lights. In a mere exercise of fancy, however, the sportiveness of a growing mind, there might be little more than was observable in other children of bright faculties, except as Pearl, in the dearth of human playmates, was thrown more upon the visionary throng which she created. The singularity lay in the hostile feelings with which the child regarded all these offspring of her own heart and mind. She never created a friend, but it seemed always to be sowing broadcast the dragon's teeth when sprung the harvest of the armed enemies, against whom she rushed to battle. It was inexpressibly sad, then, what depth of sorrow to a mother who felt in her own heart the cause, to observe in one so young this constant recognition of an adverse world, and so fierce a training of the energies that were to make good her cause in the contest that must ensue.